Martin Soto Fong was born and raised in Tucson, Arizona, to a family of mixed Mexican and Chinese descent. His childhood was marked by poverty and constant family conflict. The neighborhood where he grew up was a place where hopes faded early and teenagers grew up too fast. By the age of 17, he had dropped out of school, was scraping by with odd jobs, and dreamed of breaking out of the vicious cycle. But instead, he found himself caught up in events that would change his life forever. On the evening of June 24, 1992, 3 employees of the El Grande Market in Tucson were shot and killed during a robbery. The crime shocked the city, a quiet community where such tragedies were rare. Investigators announced that the motive was the theft of a small amount of cash. Suspicion quickly fell on 3 teenagers, among them Martin Soto Fong, who was only 17 at the time. He was arrested a few days later. Despite his young age, the investigation immediately presented him as a dangerous criminal, ruthless and cold-blooded. Prosecutor Kenneth Peasley, known for his toughness, sought the death penalty at any cost. He built his case on the testimony of the 2 other participants in the case, confessions that, as it later turned out, had been obtained under pressure. There was no physical evidence directly linking Martin to the murder, but the atmosphere of public outrage demanded a culprit, and he became one. In 1993, the jury found Soto Fong guilty on all counts and sentenced him to death. A long life of solitude began. He was transferred to a maximum security prison in Florence, where the death row cell became his world, measuring 3 by 2 meters. The lights came on at 5 in the morning and went off late at night, and short walks were the only reminder of the existence of the sky. His mother, desperate to get the case reviewed, committed suicide a few years later. His father distanced himself. The only member of the family left was his daughter, who was born shortly after his arrest. Martin wrote her letters, trying not to mention prison, and dreamed of one day seeing her without glass between them. Decades passed. Over time, it became known that Prosecutor Pisley had repeatedly falsified evidence and pressured witnesses. He himself was stripped of his license. 2 of Martin's accomplices had their sentences reviewed and were released, but Soto Fong still remained on death row, waiting for his turn. It was only on March 1, 2005, when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the death penalty for minors was unconstitutional, that his life finally changed. A guard broke the news between the evening check and lights out. "You are no longer on death row," he said. Soto Fong was silent for a long time, then cried for the first time in many years. "I thought about my mother. She fought so hard. I wish she could have seen this day," he later recalled. After the sentence was reviewed, he was transferred to a regular prison. For the first time in 10 years, he was able to write uncensored letters and call his daughter. But the struggle was not over. His lawyers continued to seek a full review of the case, pointing to investigative violations, missing evidence, and long-standing systemic errors. Today, more than 30 years later, Martin Soto Fong is still behind bars, alive but not free. Zachary Eggers was born and raised in a small town in Cochise County, Arizona, a place where life was uneventful and residents knew each other by name. His family was considered exemplary. His father, Brad Eggers, served in the Arizona Department of Corrections and had an impeccable reputation as a strict but fair man who had dedicated his life to public service. His mother, Delina Eggers, worked in the same system in an administrative position. They raised their only son in a spirit of discipline and responsibility. At first glance, it was the perfect family, respected, hardworking, reliable. But behind this facade, internal conflicts were brewing. Zachary grew up to be a withdrawn, insecure teenager who found it difficult to get along with his peers. His classmates recalled that he often sat alone in the cafeteria, avoided conversation, and got annoyed when someone tried to joke with him. In his senior years of high school, he began to distance himself even from his parents. His father demanded strict discipline, while his mother insisted on academic success. They restricted his access to the internet, imposed a curfew, and forbade him from communicating with certain friends whom they considered a bad influence. All of this made Zachary feel powerless and alienated. According to investigators, a few weeks before the tragedy, he began to show signs of depression. He stopped going to school, sat alone in his room for hours, and kept an online diary where he wrote about his feelings of loneliness. However, none of his loved ones took these warning signs seriously. Everything changed that evening when the 16-year-old teenager, overcome with anger, took his father's gun and shot him in a house near McNeil. When his mother returned home, he acted in the same way, according to the investigation, cold-bloodedly and without hesitation. After the incident, Zachary tried to cover up the traces of the crime. He dug 2 shallow graves in the backyard and buried his parents with his own hands. The next day, as if nothing had happened, he invited several classmates over for a party. The kids said he seemed calm, even cheerful, joking and saying that his parents were away. No one suspected that behind this mask lay a terrible secret. 3 days later, the Eggers colleagues raised the alarm when they didn't show up for work. When the Cochise County Sheriff arrived at the house to check on them, officers noticed fresh dirt marks in the yard. After a brief interrogation, Zachary confessed to the location of the bodies. The investigation revealed that the murders had been premeditated. The teenager had practiced using the weapon beforehand and planned how to dispose of the bodies. The prosecution charged him with 2 counts of first-degree murder and stated that it intended to try him as an adult. At the first hearing, Zachary looked pale, quiet, almost detached. His lawyer requested a psychiatric evaluation, claiming that the teenager was suffering from an emotional disorder and did not realize the consequences of his actions. The news of the tragedy shook the entire town of McNeil. Candles and photographs appeared at the gate of the family's home. Neighbors who had known Brad and Delina all their lives could not believe that such a thing could happen in their quiet community. Today, several months after his arrest, Zachary Eggers remains in custody. Chris Aguilar was born and raised in Phoenix, Arizona. His family belonged to the working class. His mother worked in the service industry, and his father frequently changed jobs. In 2025, Chris was 16 and attending Maryvale High School, a typical crowded school in the west of the city, where thousands of teenagers cross paths every day in cramped hallways, living their school lives. Teachers described him as a quiet and studious but withdrawn teenager who held his anger in. His classmates, on the other hand, knew him differently, as quick-tempered, irritable, and prone to holding grudges for weeks. One of his friends later recalled, "He didn't yell or threaten, he just got angry, deeply and silently." On August 19, 2025, everything started as a normal school day. At 10:50 a.m., while a class was in session, Chris entered the classroom where his classmate, Michael Montoya II, was sitting. No one knew that there was a conflict between them. A few weeks before the tragedy, a quarrel broke out between the teenagers. According to Aguilar, Montoya allegedly stole his gun. From that moment on, Chris became obsessed with revenge, and his friends noticed that he became gloomier, avoided conversation, and often repeated that it's not over yet. That day, he sat next to Montoya, not in his usual seat. At first, everything seemed calm, but after a few minutes, he took a folding knife engraved with his name out of his pocket and stabbed Montoya 3 times in the chest. It all happened in a matter of seconds. The students jumped up in horror, the teacher screamed, and Chris ran out of the classroom, leaving the knife on the floor. Michael was rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital, where doctors fought for his life for nearly an hour, but at noon, he was pronounced dead. One of the stab wounds pierced his lung, another hit his heart. Meanwhile, school security detained Chris near the building. He did not resist. According to the officers, he looked quiet, calm, as if he did not realize what had happened. During questioning, he refused to speak without a lawyer, citing his rights. Investigators collected video recordings from surveillance cameras and student testimonies. Several teenagers confirmed that Chris and his twin brother had previously discussed how to get revenge on Montoya, calling it restoring justice. News of the tragedy quickly spread throughout Phoenix. Candles, notes, and flowers appeared at the school gates. The next day, the Maricopa County District Attorney's Office charged Aguilar with second-degree murder. The court set bail at $500,000 in cash, not accepting property or guarantees. Under Arizona law, teenagers between the ages of 15 and 17 who are charged with murder are automatically tried as adults. Since the family was unable to post bail, Chris was placed in the Maricopa County Jail, where he awaits trial. Investigators continue to examine the circumstances of the conflict, including the origin of the weapon that, according to the prosecution, started the incident. Preston Lord was born and raised in the quiet suburb of Queen Creek, Arizona, one of those places where life flows steadily and neighbors know each other by name. His family was considered exemplary. His parents were actively involved in school life and supported their son in sports and studies. Preston was a typical 16-year-old teenager, smiling, polite, fond of playing soccer and spending evenings with friends. Teachers noted his kindness and discipline, while classmates noted his sense of humor and ability to avoid conflict. No one could have imagined that this young man would become the victim of one of the most high-profile teenage tragedies in Arizona history. On the evening of October 28, 2023, Preston went to a party in a neighboring neighborhood, a harmless gathering of school children where music was playing, teenagers were laughing, and videos were being filmed for social media. But around 11 p.m., several unknown individuals arrived on the street, and it was immediately clear from their behavior that they were looking for trouble. Investigators would later determine that this was a group known locally as the Queen Creek Gang. According to police, these young people had been involved in numerous assaults, robberies, and fights, filming their exploits on their phones. Preston went outside to meet his friends. At that moment, 7 attackers surrounded him. According to witnesses, everything happened very quickly. Someone pushed him, then there were screams, blows, and the young man fell. One of the attackers kicked him while he was lying on the asphalt. No one intervened. Many simply filmed what was happening. A few minutes later, the group disappeared. Preston was taken to the hospital in critical condition and died on October 30th from severe traumatic brain injury. The news of his death caused shock and anger throughout Arizona. Photos, footballs, and letters signed with the phrase, "For Preston," appeared at the school gates. The Queen Creek Police Department launched a large-scale investigation, which soon led to the suspects. Surveillance camera footage, eyewitness accounts, and social media posts helped identify the 7 attackers, who were teenagers between the ages of 15 and 18. It later emerged that the attack had been planned in advance. The participants had agreed in group chats, discussing who to catch and how to punish them. When it became known that one of the suspects, 18-year-old William Owen Hines, calmly took to the football field the day after the murder and played a match, the public was outraged. The school administration and the families of some of the suspects were criticized for trying to cover up the scandal. As a result, in March 2024, a grand jury indicted all 7 on first-degree murder charges. The trial began in May and became a real public event. Journalists covered every hearing, and city residents came to the courthouse with "Justice for Preston" signs. The prosecution argued that the crime was a brutal act of group violence for the sake of thrills. In 2024, Hines pleaded guilty and received 12 years in prison for murder and another 5 years for aggravated assault. The sentences were to be served consecutively. The other participants in the case are still awaiting sentencing. Preston's parents continue to fight for tougher penalties for minors involved in violent crimes. Marquis Wayne Reddick and Tayson Lynn Kent Spangler, both 17-year-old teenagers from Tucson, Arizona, found themselves at the center of a high-profile criminal case that shook the entire city. Despite their young age, they have been charged as adults with first-degree murder, armed robbery, and aggravated robbery. Their names appeared in the news after a tragic shooting that resulted in the death of 18-year-old heiress Rainey Brito Jr. Reddick and Spangler grew up in troubled neighborhoods in North Tucson, where street conflicts, guns, and criminal figures were part of everyday life. Teachers recalled that both teenagers often skipped classes and, from an early age, fell under the influence of older members of local gangs. Marquis, the son of a single mother, was arrested twice by the police for illegal possession of a weapon, but both times he avoided serious consequences. Tyson Lynn, on the other hand, already had a suspended sentence for theft and assault. Those around them described them as street kids, tough but lost. The night of August 10, 2025, proved fatal. Around midnight, shots rang out in a residential complex on East Roger Road. When the police arrived at the scene, they found heiress Brito with multiple gunshot wounds. The young man died before the ambulance arrived. Witnesses reported seeing two teenagers running away to a dark sedan. Later, the investigation established that Brito had come to a meeting, presumably related to an exchange of goods, but the conversation escalated into a conflict and an attempted robbery. According to the case file, it was Reddick and Spangle who set up the ambush. One of them pulled out a gun, demanding money and a phone. A scuffle ensued, and several shots ended Brito's life. After that, the attackers fled, but 3 weeks later they were arrested in different parts of the city. Upon arrest, one of them was found with a weapon matching the caliber of the bullets extracted from the victim's body. At the hearing on September 8th in Pima County Court, Marquis Reddick appeared unperturbed, standing with his head down, showing no emotion. The judge remanded him in custody without bail, citing a high degree of danger to the community. Spangler, who was arrested in connection with another case, was granted bail of $1 million, but his chances of being released before trial are minimal. The prosecution claims that the crime was premeditated and deliberate. According to the prosecutor, the teenagers agreed in advance to set up the victim and use the weapon as a means of pressure. The defense attorneys, on the other hand, insist that everything happened spontaneously. According to their version, the shots were fired during a struggle, and the death was a tragic consequence of panic. The Tucson Police Department is continuing its investigation, analyzing footage from street cameras and social media correspondence. Aries Adler grew up in Chandler, Arizona, in a family where, according to neighbors, there was always tension. His parents often argued, sometimes not speaking to each other for weeks, creating an atmosphere of instability in which children learn to survive rather than trust. At school, Aries seemed like a normal teenager, quiet, unobtrusive, prone to loneliness. But behind his outward calm lay anxiety and growing irritability. Teachers noticed sudden outbursts of anger, and classmates noticed a tendency toward dark jokes and unpredictable reactions. By his senior years, his behavior had deteriorated. He began skipping classes, disrupting lessons, and withdrawing. School psychologists recommended an evaluation, but according to acquaintances, his parents did not believe in such problems and limited themselves to reprimanding him. He received no support, only further distancing himself from his family and peers. Among the few who showed concern for him was 42-year-old Toni Harper, a neighbor and acquaintance of the family. She believed that the teenager simply needed attention and trust, so she invited him to help around the house and often had heart-to-heart talks with him. According to those close to her, Toni saw Aries as a difficult but good boy who could be helped. However, over time, their relationship became increasingly strained. The teenager perceived her advice as reproaches and her attempts to restrict his behavior as a personal betrayal. On the night of the tragedy, a conflict arose in Toni's house, the reasons for which have never been fully established. The investigation showed that the teenager's actions were not spontaneous. Before the attack, he cut the phone lines, turned off the Wi-Fi, and hid mobile devices so that no one could call for help. These details became key evidence of his deliberate actions. When the neighbors heard the screams, the woman was already fatally wounded. She died before the ambulance arrived, managing to whisper, "I think Aries did it." After the crime, the teenager tried to flee, but was arrested a few hours later. A knife matching the murder weapon and blood-stained clothing were found on him. During questioning, he initially denied guilt, but then made a partial confession, saying that he just wanted her to shut up. These words sounded like a confession in the courtroom, striking even experienced investigators. The prosecution insisted that he be tried as an adult, citing exceptional cruelty and an attempt to conceal the crime. The hearings lasted several years, and each session was an emotional ordeal for the victim's family. Tony's relatives came to the courtroom with her photographs, demanding justice. The defense responded by presenting medical reports, anxiety disorder, depressive episodes, emotional breakdowns. In October 2024, the court found him guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced him to 13 years in prison. The judge called the decision a compromise between retribution and understanding human weakness. Today, Aries Adele is serving his sentence in an Arizona State Correctional Facility, where he is undergoing a therapeutic program for juvenile offenders. Eric Clark, a teenager from Flagstaff, Arizona, had suffered from severe mental illness since childhood. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia long before the tragic events of 2000. His parents, concerned about his condition, sought medical help on several occasions, but prolonged treatment did not produce stable results. By the age of 16, the young man had become withdrawn, irritable, and prone to hallucinations. He was convinced that aliens had invaded Earth and that many people, including his loved ones, had been replaced. This delusional system became his reality, in which he existed without understanding the difference between truth and illness. Early in the morning on June 21st, 2000, Eric, who was 17, took his brother's truck keys and went for a drive around the neighborhood. He turned the music up loud and drove down the same street several times, causing concern among residents. Neighbors called the police to stop the noise. Officer Jeffrey Moritz responded to the call. When he tried to stop Eric, Eric shot him several times, fatally wounding him. Investigators later determined that the teenager was convinced that he was not dealing with a police officer, but with an alien trying to kill him. After his arrest, Clark did not resist and, according to eyewitnesses, appeared confused and disoriented. His mental state raised doubts about his ability to understand what was happening. The court ordered a psychiatric evaluation, which found that Eric suffered from a chronic mental illness but was sane enough to stand trial. He was charged with first-degree murder of a law enforcement officer in the line of duty. From the outset, Clark's defense sought to have him declared insane. The lawyers argued that the young man was not aware of the nature of his actions and that his perception of reality was completely distorted by his illness. As evidence, they presented the testimony of psychiatrists, medical records, and testimony from his family. However, the prosecution referred to Arizona law, where the standard for finding insanity was significantly limited. According to ARS Paragraph 13-502, a defendant can only be found guilty except as to insanity if, at the time of the crime, he did not know that his actions were unlawful. Thus, the court refused to consider evidence of mental disorder to refute the essential element of the crime, mens rea, or intent. The defense's argument that the illness deprived Clark of the ability to act consciously was rejected. The trial court found Eric guilty of first-degree murder. His sentence sparked widespread debate about the limits of justice and the extent to which state laws should take into account the mental state of the defendant. Clark appealed the decision, arguing that Arizona law violated his right to due process guaranteed by the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The appeal argued that denying the opportunity to use evidence of mental illness to challenge guilt was contrary to fundamental principles of justice. According to the defense, Arizona had unlawfully narrowed the traditional standard of insanity based on the Manhattan test, which takes into account not only awareness of wrongdoing, but also understanding of the nature of the act itself. The prosecution argued that the Constitution does not require states to apply the Manhattan test specifically, and that each jurisdiction has the right to determine the scope of criminal responsibility independently. State representatives argued that Arizona's law was a reasonable compromise that prevented abuse of the mental illness defense. The court noted that evidence of mental illness could not automatically negate guilt if the defendant knew that killing a police officer was illegal. Jacob Weidman was born into a wealthy family where he was expected to be successful and self-disciplined. His father, a well-known writer, raised his son in an atmosphere of intellectual pressure and high expectations. On the outside, Jacob seemed like a typical quiet teenager, smart, a little withdrawn, reserved, but behind his outward calm lay signs of inner instability, outbursts of anger, alienation, and difficulty adapting emotionally. At summer camp in Maine, he didn't stand out, but he didn't cause any concern either. It was there that he met 16-year-old Eric Kahn, a good-natured and responsive teenager who quickly won the sympathy of his peers. No one could have imagined that this chance friendship would end in a brutal murder. In July 1986, the camp organized its traditional trip to the west, which included a stop in Flagstaff, Arizona. Eric and Jacob ended up as roommates at the hotel. That night, for no apparent reason, Weidman took a knife and stabbed Eric twice in the chest, leaving him to die. He showed no signs of panic. He simply stole the keys from the camp counselor, got in his car, and drove away. He later turned himself into the police and confessed to the murder, saying he didn't know why he did it. Investigators found no quarrel, no conflict, no jealousy, just senseless, cold-blooded violence. The investigation soon went beyond the local level. Public attention was drawn not only to the senseless murder, but also to the figure of Weidman's father, a respected writer who tried to protect his son from publicity. During questioning, Jacob showed emotional detachment, expressed no remorse, and responded calmly, which only reinforced the feeling of incomprehensibility of his actions. A year after the murder, he confessed to another crime, but later recanted his statement, which reinforced the theory that he was suffering from a severe mental disorder. In 1988, the court found Weidman guilty of first-degree murder. The judge noted that although the law allows for parole after 25 years, he strongly recommended that the parole board never grant such a request. Jacob was sent to an Arizona prison, where he proved himself to be a model prisoner in the following years. He received an education, participated in psychological programs, and did not violate discipline. However, prison psychologists repeatedly pointed out that his calmness and submissiveness were more a form of adaptation than a sign of sincere repentance. The story took a new turn in 2016 when ABC 15 journalists discovered that Weidman had married two of his prison psychologists. One of these marriages caused a serious scandal, as his wife, Dr. Martha DeSoto, had a contract with the Arizona Department of Child Safety at the time. After the investigation was published, the contract was terminated, but public outrage did not subside. That same year, the Executive Pardon Board unexpectedly released Weidman to house arrest. The decision came as a shock. A murderer whom a judge had once recommended should never be released was now free. However, a few months later, he was returned to prison for violating the terms of his release. He failed to attend an appointment with a psychologist. His lawyers claimed that the revocation process had been conducted improperly and filed a series of complaints, arguing that Weidman had been denied the right to a fair hearing. The case regained popularity in the media, with journalists writing about how the system could not decide whether to consider him remorseful or dangerous. In the fall of 2024, it became known that a possible settlement agreement was in the works, under which Weidman could be released to house arrest again and participate in rehabilitation programs in Phoenix. The family of the murdered Eric was horrified by this news. The teenager's father, Sandy Kane, said that releasing his son's killer would be an insult to Eric's memory and an example of the injustice of the judicial system. He called Weidman a manipulator who has learned to say what people want to hear. Israel Mika Lee Hanlon Salazar was born and raised in Tucson, Arizona. By the age of 16, he already knew what life on the streets, aggression, and fear were like. Growing up in a disadvantaged neighborhood where crime was a part of everyday life, Israel learned early on to rely only on himself. His family lived modestly, his mother worked 2 jobs, and he hardly knew his father. At school, Salazar was considered a withdrawn teenager who often got into conflicts and rarely found common ground with his peers. Teachers noted his intelligence, but also his uncontrollability, outbursts of rage, and dangerous fascination with weapons. All of this was a prelude to the tragic events that would soon change his life forever. In July 2024, Israel found himself at the center of a conflict that escalated into the murder of 15-year-old Deidrean Brown. That evening, a group of teenagers gathered for a house party on East 26th Street in Tucson. According to witnesses, the atmosphere was tense. Alcohol, loud music, and mutual taunts created the conditions for conflict. A quarrel broke out between 2 groups of young people, which quickly spiraled out of control. Israel, who was standing next to his older friend, Katron Devin McClendon, got involved in the altercation, trying to support his buddy. The dispute ended in tragedy when McClendon pulled out a gun, and Israel, according to the investigation, helped him and even encouraged him to shoot. It all happened in a matter of seconds. Several shots were fired, and Deidrean Brown, a teenager who was not involved in the argument, was left lying on the ground. Israel and the others tried to flee, but within a few days, the Tucson police had identified all the suspects. CCTV footage, witness statements, and digital evidence allowed investigators to piece together the full picture of the incident. Israel was arrested in a house in South Tucson, where he had been hiding after the attack. He did not resist arrest and simply told the officers quietly that he didn't want it to go this far. Investigators determined that Salazar played an active role in the incident. He was the one who incited McClendon, shouted threats, and helped him escape after the shooting. Although he did not fire any shots himself, his participation was deemed crucial in escalating the conflict. During questioning, Israel claimed that he had acted under pressure from his elders and that he did not want to harm anyone. However, the prosecution presented evidence that he was aware of McClendon's intention to use the weapon and made no attempt to stop him. When the case went to trial, the Tucson community was shocked. Despite his age, Israel was charged as an adult with first-degree murder, armed robbery, and complicity in the crime. The judge set bail at $2 million, which effectively meant he would remain in custody until the trial began. In the courtroom, Israel looked frightened and avoided eye contact with the family of the deceased teenager. His mother, a quiet middle-aged woman, could not hold back her tears as she watched her son listen to the indictment. The prosecution argued that Salazar's behavior demonstrated conscious participation and a willingness to commit violence. Prosecutor Rachel Stiles emphasized that age cannot be used as an excuse when it comes to human life. The defense, on the other hand, focused on the psychological pressure and immaturity of the defendant, arguing that the teenager was a victim of peer pressure. Israel's lawyer reminded the court that at the time of the incident, his client was in a state of panic and did not realize the consequences. The court hearings, scheduled for November and December, have been the subject of intense media attention. Deidrean Brown's family demanded the maximum punishment, stating that the killer's age should not mitigate his responsibility. Memorials and posters with the words, "Justice for Deidrean," appeared on the streets of Tucson, and school communities launched a campaign against teenage violence. Victor Donovan Morales, a 16-year-old teenager from Phoenix, did not seem to differ from his peers at first glance. He attended high school at a local school, enjoyed video games, and spent most of his time on the internet. Neighbors described him as a quiet but polite young man who rarely engaged in conversation and tried to avoid attention. However, beneath his outward calm lay a growing inner conflict, strained family relationships, emotional outbursts, and feelings of isolation, which investigators now believe set the stage for the tragedy that shook Maricopa County. On an evening in early September 2024, a small family gathering was taking place in a house in South Phoenix. The atmosphere was typical for such gatherings: conversation, music, parents trying to connect with their son, who had recently become increasingly withdrawn. However, the peaceful evening ended in horror. According to police, shots were fired at around 9 p.m. When officers arrived at the scene, they found a 47-year-old man, Victor's father, with multiple gunshot wounds. His mother, a 42-year-old woman, had been shot in the arm and was taken to the hospital. The father did not survive, but the mother was able to give initial testimony to investigators, saying that the shooter was their own son. According to the police report, only 3 people were in the house at the time of the incident: Victor and his parents. In the backyard, law enforcement officers found a rifle believed to belong to the teenager, and nearby, a shell casing of the same caliber from which the shots were fired. No signs of forced entry or outside interference were found. This immediately gave reason to believe that the incident was an act of domestic violence. Maricopa County Prosecutor Rachel Mitchell confirmed that Morales faces serious charges, including second-degree murder, aggravated assault, and several counts of public disorder. All crimes are classified as dangerous and related to domestic violence. The indictment also includes 2 counts of unlawful use of a weapon. The court set the teenager's bail at $1 million, and his first court hearing is scheduled for November 2024. According to preliminary data, there had been tension between Victor and his father for a long time. Sources close to the family said that the teenager felt pressure due to constant arguments related to his studies and discipline. His father, a former military man, had a strict character, and their conflicts often escalated into shouting matches. According to neighbors, his mother tried to smooth things over, but recently she had increasingly noticed her son's emotional instability. On the day of the tragedy, according to investigators, the argument began over restrictions on the use of the family car. After another exchange of reproaches, Victor went to his room and returned a few minutes later with a weapon. The investigation continues to examine the circumstances under which the teenager gained access to the rifle. According to the prosecutor's office, the weapon was stored in the house legally but was not properly secured, which allowed Victor to use it without his parents' knowledge. Investigators are also considering the possibility that the crime was impulsive, committed in a state of intense emotional distress. However, the nature of the injuries and the defendant's behavior after the shooting, he did not attempt to call an ambulance and did not leave the house, suggest that he was partially aware of his actions. In court, Prosecutor Mitchell emphasized that despite the defendant's age, the crime is particularly serious and should be tried under adult law. She noted that in such cases, it is important not only to protect victims of domestic violence, but also to prevent the recurrence of similar tragedies in families where conflict and weapons become a deadly combination. The defense, in turn, said it would seek a psychiatric evaluation, as Victor had recently shown signs of depression and instability. Hunter William Mace is a name that became known throughout Arizona after the tragic events that took place in Glendale in 2019. At the time of the crime, he was only 16 years old. Raised in a middle-class suburban family, Hunter was considered a normal teenager, quiet, a little withdrawn, but without any significant disciplinary problems. His parents were divorced, and he lived most of the time with his mother, who worked as a nurse. Teachers remembered him as a capable but unsociable student who tended to isolate himself. However, his outward reserve hid a deep inner instability. After his parents' divorce, Mace began to show increasing aggression and interest in weapons. He spent hours playing war-themed video games and kept an online diary where he wrote about the need to show the world what he was capable of. By the time of the tragedy, Hunter was already under the supervision of a school psychologist due to episodes of depression and a pronounced sense of loneliness. His friends noted that he often spoke about injustice and that people deserve retribution. Experts later determined that the teenager suffered from a combination of post-traumatic stress disorder and personality disorder, complicated by the use of marijuana and antidepressants without medical supervision. The crime itself took place on October 7, 2019. On that day, Mays went to the home of his acquaintance, 17-year-old Dylan Hayward, with whom he had previously had a conflict over money. According to witnesses, Hunter was holding a firearm which, as it turned out later, he had taken from his stepfather's safe. After a brief argument, the teenager shot Hayward and then fled the scene on a bicycle. Within a few hours, the Glendale police conducted a large-scale search, and by the evening of the same day, Mays was arrested in one of the abandoned houses nearby. He did not resist arrest and immediately confessed to the crime, stating that he did not want to kill, but could not stop himself. The investigation revealed that Mays had carefully prepared for the encounter. Messages were found on his phone in which he discussed with a friend the possibility of punishing Hayward. Notes were also found in which the teenager discussed revenge and how society ignores the suffering of those who remain silent. This evidence allowed the prosecution to bring a first-degree murder charge. However, the defense insisted that the crime was not premeditated but committed in the heat of the moment. The trial caused a public outcry. On the one hand, the public demanded severe punishment, pointing to the cold-bloodedness with which Hunter acted. On the other hand, lawyers and psychologists spoke of the need to take into account his age, mental state, and life circumstances. The court hearings lasted several months. Psychiatrists testifying for the defense claimed that Mays was not fully aware of the consequences of his actions and was in a state of emotional distress. The prosecution, on the contrary, presented evidence of intent. The weapon had been loaded in advance, and the crime scene had not been chosen at random. In June 2021, the Maricopa County District Court found Hunter William Mays guilty of second-degree murder and unlawful possession of a firearm by a minor. The judge noted that although the defendant's actions were not entirely deliberate, he demonstrated sufficient awareness to understand the gravity of what was happening. Hunter was sentenced to 25 years in prison with the right to parole after 20 years. He was 18 at the time of sentencing. The public reaction was mixed. The parents of the deceased young man said the sentence was too lenient as their son will not get a second chance. Hunter's mother, on the other hand, insisted that the system had failed to provide her son with adequate support when he was struggling with depression. She said that it was only after his arrest that he received professional psychiatric help for the first time and began to realize the magnitude of what he had done. Clarissa Sanchez, a 17-year-old girl from Tucson, seemed at first glance to be an ordinary high school student, quiet, somewhat withdrawn, but an obedient daughter. She rarely attracted attention at school, and her friends said she was always afraid of her father, 38-year-old Andres Sanchez, a strict but hard-working man. To their neighbors, the family seemed stable, a father who worked as a mechanic and a daughter he was raising alone after his divorce. However, behind the facade of ordinary life, a conspiracy was gradually brewing that led to one of the most shocking tragedies in Pima County. In the spring of 2023, Clarissa began dating Larry Raimundo Coronado, a 20-year-old young man she met through friends. The relationship quickly became intense and codependent. Clarissa saw Larry not just as her lover, but as her savior from her father's control. Andres did not approve of the relationship, considering Coronado a bad influence. He forbade his daughter from seeing him, and this prohibition became the catalyst for the future crime. Clarissa, under emotional pressure, began to convince Larry that the only way to be together was to eliminate her father. In June of that year, the couple made a plan. Coronado was to enter Sanchez's house at night while he was asleep, and Clarissa promised to leave the door unlocked. On the night of the crime, she quietly unlocked the door and waited in her room for her boyfriend to enter. The investigation decided not to disclose the full details of the murder, but according to court documents, Coronado acted decisively, delivering fatal blows to Andres Sanchez. After the incident, Clarissa did not call the police, but instead helped Coronado clean up the bloodstains using household chemicals. They wiped the floors, collected the blood-stained clothes, and threw them into a dumpster near the house. When Andres' colleagues raised the alarm the next morning because he had not shown up for work, the police found the body in the bedroom. There were no signs of forced entry in the house, which immediately led investigators to believe that the perpetrator was acquainted with the victim. The interrogation of the daughter revealed contradictions in her testimony, and after several hours of questioning, Clarissa confessed that she had helped Coronado. The police arrested both of them, the girl at her aunt's house and her boyfriend in an apartment on the other side of Tucson. In court, Coronado stated that he had acted at Clarissa's request. According to him, she had repeatedly complained that her father was threatening her and was going to send her to boarding school to end their relationship. Prosecutors, however, argued that Coronado was not motivated by love, but by a desire for control. He used the young girl to justify his crime. The prosecution had sufficient evidence. Messages exchanged via instant messengers discussing the details of the murder and surveillance camera footage showing Coronado near Sanchez's home an hour before the crime. In November 2024, Coronado was found guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and burglary. Pima County Superior Court Judge Paul Tang sentenced him to life in prison with the possibility of parole in 25 years. Clarissa, who was a key witness, pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for a reduced sentence. At the final hearing, she appeared confused and depressed. Speaking before the court, she cried, saying that she never wanted it to end in death. Prosecutors emphasized that although Clarissa was a minor, she knowingly participated in planning the murder. The court took into account her age and dependent status, but also noted the cold-blooded nature of her actions after the crime. As a result, the court sentenced her to 21 years in prison. Joshua Cade Richardson, a 14-year-old teenager from the small town of Concho, Arizona, became the defendant in a case that shook the entire community. Despite his age, the Apache County Court ruled to try him as an adult for first-degree murder, attempted armed robbery, and aggravated assault. For many residents, this case became a symbol of the loss of trust in a world where even a child is capable of deliberate violence. Joshua grew up in a dysfunctional family. According to neighbors, his parents often left the boy unsupervised, and from an early age, he gravitated toward older groups. He did not stand out at school. He was quiet and withdrawn, but some of his classmates found him disturbing. Teachers noted his tendency toward aggression, outbursts of irritation, and interest in weapons. According to the investigation, in the months leading up to the crime, the teenager increasingly spent time with people who involved him in petty theft and robbery. On October 3, 2024, Joshua arrived at the Collins family's property in Concho. The family had recently moved there from Mesa to start a new life away from the hustle and bustle of the city. Terry Lynn Collins, a kind and caring woman, was at home that day with her daughter and her daughter's friend. Her husband, Ernest Collins, a lawyer, was working in Mesa and talking to his wife on the phone when it all happened. According to investigators, the teenager came to the house with the intention of stealing a car parked in the yard. He was armed with a gun, a knife, and a hockey stick, improvised weapons to intimidate. When he broke into the house, Colin's daughter and her friend came face to face with the armed stranger. The girls tried to resist, but Richardson threatened them, silencing them. In a panic, the daughter managed to send her mother a message asking for help. Terry Lynn immediately called her husband and, without waiting for the police, headed for the house. During the conversation, Ernest heard strange sounds through the phone, screams, a struggle, and then a gunshot. "I realized that something terrible was happening," he later said. "I called a neighbor and asked him to check the house, but it was too late." When the police arrived at the scene, Terry Lynn was dead. She had been shot in the head. Investigators say the murder was committed in cold blood, almost at point-blank range. The girls managed to hide and were unharmed. At the crime scene, police found signs of a struggle and items left behind by the perpetrator, including a mask and fingerprints. The investigation lasted only a few days. The victim's daughter gave the police photos and videos taken on her phone, which showed a teenager wearing a ski mask on their property. This footage allowed Richardson to be identified, and he was soon arrested in the Pine Top Lakeside area. According to the police, the suspect's parents themselves reported his disappearance and later identified their son as a participant in the crime. Joshua remained silent during his arrest. His lawyers later claimed that the boy did not realize the seriousness of his actions and was in a state of emotional instability. However, the prosecution insists that the crime was premeditated. The teenager arrived armed, knew that there were people in the house, and acted deliberately. These facts formed the basis for the decision to try him as an adult. Public opinion is divided. Some believe that age cannot be an excuse for such a cruel act, while others see it as a tragedy of immaturity and social neglect. "He knew what he was doing," said the Apache County prosecutor, "but he chose murder to get rid of a witness." The victim's husband, Ernest Collins, still remembers that day with pain. "I heard her scream to her daughter, 'Run,' and then the shot. She always protected everyone around her, even in her last moments." In an interview, he described his wife as a kind, caring woman who was actively involved in the community. After the tragedy, neighbors raised funds for the family and organized a memorial service for Terry Lynn, where dozens of people lit candles in her honor. After his arrest, Joshua was placed in a juvenile detention center, but due to the severity of the charges, the case was transferred to adult court. The judge noted that the nature of the crime and the degree of awareness of the teenager's actions made it impossible to consider his case in the juvenile system. His lawyers filed a motion for an independent psychiatric evaluation, insisting that the boy suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder caused by domestic violence and neglect by his parents. The tragedy sparked a widespread public debate about the juvenile crime prevention system. Meetings with psychologists were held in Apache County schools, and city authorities announced the need to strengthen social services. Local media called the Richardson case one of the most disturbing in the state's history, emphasizing that Arizona remains one of the few states where teenagers as young as 14 can be tried as adults. The trial of Joshua Richardson is scheduled for early 2026. His lawyers are seeking a review of the adult court decision, arguing that the teenager needs psychiatric help, not life imprisonment. The prosecution, on the other hand, is pushing for the maximum punishment, saying the crime was premeditated and leaves no room for leniency. Ariana Ramirez, a 15-year-old student from Phoenix, found herself at the center of a high-profile criminal case that sparked heated debate about juvenile responsibility and the limits of the law in Arizona. She is charged with first-degree murder, even though, as the defense points out, she did not pull the trigger. Prosecutors argue that Ariana's participation in an armed robbery that ended in the death of another teenager makes her an accomplice under the law on murder in connection with the commission of a serious crime. This case has become one of the most discussed examples of how minors in Arizona are tried as adults. Before the tragedy, Ariana lived with her mother and younger brother in the western part of the city. According to neighbors, she was withdrawn, but in the months leading up to her arrest, she began spending time with older teenagers. At school, teachers noted her as a capable but troubled student who often skipped classes. Investigators determined that on the night of the crime, she and 3 other teenagers participated in a robbery aimed at stealing drugs and money from an acquaintance of the same age. According to the case file, 15-year-old Ramirez helped plan the attack. She arranged to meet with the victim to lure him to the right place, and her 2 accomplices were supposed to carry out the robbery. Things did not go according to plan. One of the teenagers pulled out a gun, a fight broke out, and a shot was fired. The bullet fatally wounded a 16-year-old member of the group who was caught in the crossfire. The police arrived at the scene a few minutes later, finding the teenager's body and 2 suspects fleeing. Ariana was arrested later that day after she returned home and attempted to delete messages from her phone. The investigation revealed that she knew where the gun was and had given it to another participant in the crime. Although Ramirez claimed she did not expect violence and did not want anyone to get hurt, prosecutors said her actions made the killing possible. Under Arizona's murder during the commission of a felony law, she bears the same responsibility as the shooter. When the case went to trial, the decision to charge Ariana as an adult sparked an outcry. Juvenile rights advocates called it unnecessarily harsh, pointing out that 15-year-olds do not yet have the maturity to understand the consequences of their actions. This is not a cold-blooded killer. This is a child who made the wrong decision under pressure from her peers, said one of the public defenders. Prosecutors, on the other hand, insisted on the opposite. According to them, the crime was planned, and Ramirez's participation was deliberate. During the hearings, they presented correspondence in which Ariana discussed the details of the robbery and suggested a meeting place. One of the texts, sent an hour before the crime, contained the phrase, "Everything is ready, he will come, just take what is yours." This text became key evidence for the prosecution. The mother of the deceased teenager, speaking in court, said, "It doesn't matter who pulled the trigger. They all knew what they were doing. My son is dead, and someone has to answer for it." Her words evoked deep emotion in the courtroom. The trial turned into a dispute not only about guilt, but also about justice. The defense sought to have the charge reclassified as aiding and abetting a robbery, arguing that the murder was not premeditated. However, the judge agreed with the prosecution's position, leaving Ariana's status as an adult defendant unchanged. She faces life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Ryan David Petty was born and raised in a small town near Phoenix, Arizona. At the time of the tragic events that changed his life and the lives of many others, he was only 17 years old. He came from an outwardly prosperous family. His father was a mechanic and his mother was a school librarian. Ryan was an only child and from an early age was sensitive and withdrawn. Teachers described him as a quiet but intelligent teenager who rarely took the initiative and hardly ever participated in school activities. However, his outward calm concealed a growing inner instability. After the death of his grandfather, to whom he was very attached, Ryan began to experience episodes of severe anxiety, irritability, and isolation. By the age of 16, he was having his first problems at school, skipping classes, arguing with classmates, and conflicts with teachers. His mother repeatedly sought help from the school psychologist, but the visits never developed into full-fledged treatment. During this period, Ryan became actively interested in weapons and websites discussing topics such as violence, revenge, and alienation. According to his friends, he often complained about feeling unfairly treated, that no one understands him, and that the world is hostile towards him. The tragedy occurred on March 14, 2020, in the small town of Santan Valley. Ryan had a falling out with his close friend, 18-year-old Jason Clark, over a girl they both knew. According to witnesses, the argument began on social media and escalated into a face-to-face confrontation. During the argument at Clark's house, Ryan took a gun belonging to his father out of his bag and, in a state of intense emotional distress, fired a shot. Jason died on the spot. After that, the teenager tried to flee, but a few hours later he called the police himself and confessed to what he had done. The arrest went smoothly, The police officers who arrived at the address found Ryan sitting on the sidewalk with his phone in his hands. He did not resist and immediately admitted that he regretted what had happened. Notes were later found in his room in which he wrote about feelings of hopelessness, loneliness, and the conviction that his life was meaningless. The investigation established that the teenager did not have a premeditated plan to commit murder. Everything happened impulsively, against the backdrop of an emotional breakdown and prolonged personal turmoil. Investigators and prosecutors approached the case with particular care, given the age of the accused and his mental state. A psychiatric examination revealed signs of depression, strong feelings of guilt, and remorse. At the same time, experts noted that Ryan was aware of the nature of his actions, but acted under the influence of emotion. The trial began in December 2021 and lasted almost 6 months. The prosecution insisted on classifying the crime as second-degree murder, emphasizing that Petty deliberately brought a weapon with him and used it in the conflict. The defense, in turn, based its position on the fact that the crime was not premeditated and occurred as a result of a psychological breakdown. Psychologists, teachers, and even a priest who worked with the teenager after his arrest testified at the trial. They all said that Ryan had not been a danger to society prior to this incident, but was emotionally unstable and in need of treatment. In May 2022, the Pinal County Court found Ryan David Petty guilty of second-degree murder. The judge took into account his age, guilty plea, and sincere remorse, sentencing him to 20 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. At the time of sentencing, Ryan cried and turned to Jason's parents, asking for their forgiveness. The victim's mother was unable to hold back her tears and said that compassion is not an excuse, but perhaps a path to healing.